the first international publication on the subject of soil contamination in many years, in 2013 by Springer. So I draw that to your attention. I acknowledge the work by Elizabeth Brandon in what I'm about to say, because it's largely based on her research, which I supervised. To put this in context, there's a lot of words here, and I'll go very quickly through them in terms of the time we have. But soil contamination is now, I think, widely recognised in Western countries as a major environmental issue and a consequence of industrialisation. The sorts of sources of contamination are set out in the second dot point. But what we have to, I think, understand is that these problems are now replicating in developing countries as industrialisation proceeds in other parts of the world. And so the progress that is being achieved economically is again likely to come, particularly in urban centres in developing countries, at the cost of soil contamination, particularly through inappropriate waste disposal practices, as UNEP itself noticed back in 2005. There is also another problem which may not lend itself to a legal response, but it is a desperate problem in some parts of Asia, and that is the problem of arsenic contamination, where drinking water from surface water resources has become so polluted that people have now turned to groundwater as a drinking water source in parts of India, Bangladesh and China. But the naturally occurring arsenic in the soils is contaminating these private supplies, and illness and death from arsenic contamination of soils and groundwater is now a major health problem in some parts of the world. If you look at the extent of soil contamination, one of the difficulties is there are very few reliable statistics about the full range of problems that exist, particularly in developing parts of the world, and I include here in Eastern Europe, in parts of Eastern Europe where the economies are in a sense developed, but the history of such, of their development is that there were very few controls over pollution of soil and water. The numbers that you see for Europe on this slide vary from somewhere around 300,000 up to 1.5 million suspected sites, according to which authority you refer to. The USA is well known for its Superfund legislation, but that is just the tip of the iceberg, if you like, in terms of the 1,500 odd sites that were listed on the Superfund priority list. There are thousands more sites across the United States and indeed in Canada and also in my own country of Australia. And this is a legacy that we've inherited in the developed world. For developing countries, the data is much less. At this stage, there is A, little awareness of the problem, and B, almost no effort to catalogue and identify the extent of the problem. One of the statistics I thought which was most interesting from a Chinese scholar in 2007 was the estimate that perhaps 10% of arable land in China is affected by soil and or water contamination. And I know that in China there is at the moment efforts being made to develop national legislation on this problem. What could we do? The conclusion effectively that was reached in the research work that I've referred to by Elizabeth Brandon, based in part on looking at the recent EU experience, which I think Bernard Van Husen will talk about shortly, with the Draft Soils Directive, is that we're probably going to be, it would be an unwise step to try to incorporate soil contamination as an issue in the proposed global protocol. This is probably going to lead to serious difficulties for some nation states in terms of all the issues around liability that attach with respect to this area. Most legal responses are first and foremost designed to set a framework for addressing the responsibility for historic soil contamination, and the issues around legal liability have been addressed in different ways by different countries. And I think that the conclusion is probably correct, that if we want to have a soil protocol, it will probably impede its progress by trying to include this particular dimension in those discussions. There's also, in the work that was done by Brandon, there's actually more going on in the international level than you would realise in terms of soil contamination amongst scientific communities, etc. But there is very little in the way of interest or enthusiasm for a standalone instrument on soil contamination. The idea of proposing a new treaty at this stage in the context of global treaty fatigue is not something that appears to have much carriage, and is not probably a realistic proposition. And therefore, the conclusion that was reached in her research, and which I very much agree with, is that the bottom-up approach of trying to develop some sort of model framework law on soil contamination, which could be used as a basis for developing countries to adopt their own legislation, adapting it to their specific circumstances, is perhaps the best approach. And in her work, she's actually gone to the extent of developing some basic principles for site contamination law that might form the essence of a model law. And I have raised here the question of whether within the Commission we may wish to do some more work to promote that concept. So that's the conclusion on that. I really don't have a lot of time to speak about soil and carbon sequestration now, and I'd certainly welcome any inputs from the audience, including from Lou, on matters here where I may not have a fully accurate view of what is actually going on in these complex negotiations. It is interesting to note, however, that in fact, whilst the loss of carbon from soil is a serious concern in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gas pollution, in fact it's nitrous oxide and methane that are the major direct greenhouse gas emissions. But they've been of less concern in the discussions because it's been in the context of possible carbon offsets in relation to CO2 in the soil that most of the policy discussion, such as it is, has taken place so far. The importance of soils in terms of carbon has already been emphasised by several speakers. I've tried to put some figures up here, I won't dwell on them now, to underline that. How much carbon we have stored in the soil, and also, in fact, how much has been lost over the past 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the developed world, in the advanced economies. There's a very good report by Henry Hingeveld for Environment Canada on this subject, which I've used in other presentations, making the point that up to something like 30% of soil carbon has been lost, for example, in Canada, but they're approaching a kind of stasis or equilibrium because they're not expanding their agricultural lands in the same way as is happening in the developing countries. And so it's again in that context of conversion of forested lands to croplands that was picked up in some of the earlier slides. That's where we're going to see the future losses of soil carbon. I have some figures here from Europe as well. Just to note, a couple of quotes here from the European Environment Agency pointing out how, in fact, the sequestration of soil carbon is a very important element of the overall response to climate change that can't be ignored. It can't be the solution by itself, but at the moment it is. If soil is the, what did you call it, Ben? The cousin? The poor cousin. Well, if soil is the poor cousin in the international community, soil carbon is the poor cousin at the moment in the climate change debates. I think that's how we could perhaps summarise it. To finish, what are we looking for in this context? And I think here I would suggest again that the soil protocol can do a little bit, but not a great deal. But this is probably a matter that needs to be addressed through the climate change framework convention and its various instruments. But we're really trying to achieve, I think, three things in terms of mitigation policy here. The first is to avoid further soil carbon loss as far as possible through poor agricultural land management practices. So to the extent that a global protocol encourages sound land management practices, it will at the same time help to deliver that outcome. A specific issue is avoiding soil carbon loss as a result of actual actions of their own to mitigate climate change, in particular the production of biofuels. And here we are, I think, desperately needing to strengthen the legal and policy framework. This is where the Academy has actually been involved with as well, in terms of setting in place clear guidelines for biofuels production which don't come at the expense of soil and soil carbon. Finally, enhancing biosequestration. We could actually put the soils to better use. We could restore levels of carbon in the soils where those have been lost in the future, possibly through things such as the use of biochar. Now, because of the time, I will finish fairly quickly now. I just want to close by saying that I think if we have a new protocol of some kind, it is very important that it recognises this component of the management of soil, that at least it incorporates within its objectives a statement concerning the need for protection and enhancement of soil carbon stocks. But I think that beyond that, the actual mechanisms are probably more likely to need to be developed in the context of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Clean Development Mechanism in terms of specific, particularly around carbon offsetting. And that was what I wanted to conclude by saying a little bit about. I've noted here the ongoing problems with the issue of measurement of soil carbon, which is still being addressed. Let me close by just saying that in terms of carbon offsets, that is being able to attract certified emission credits under the Clean Development Mechanism in relation to soil carbon loss that has been avoided. There are a very similar set of problems here, I think, to those that are needing to be addressed in the context of REDD+. You have the same issues around transparency, measurement, performance, permanence, etc. Can the carbon be stored permanently? And for this to be taken up, those issues will have to be addressed alike to the way in which they are being thought through in the context of REDD+. And my understanding was that there was a work program established in 2011 by the subsidiary body under the Kyoto Protocol, but I'm not sure how far that's got. It obviously is at a very low level at the moment, and that's part of the difficulty. I also want to draw attention to a report that is actually on the UN Framework Convention website, which was prepared by a group of environmental NGOs and which puts the case very powerfully for actually not allowing carbon offsets for soil, in relation to soil. I can't go into all the arguments now, but their conclusion was that in the post-2012 context, in fact, there should be resistance to the idea of carbon offsets, carbon credits arising from sound agricultural practices. And they have a number of reasons for putting that view. In relation to biofuels, I note here some work that is going on in terms of guidelines on sound biofuel production methods, and particularly work by the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels. And finally, on enhanced sequestration, again, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for some technical solutions like use of biochar, but again, there are reservations about this in terms of its feasibility, its suitability according to different types of soils, etc. And so whilst there was a lot of promise held out by some proponents of the idea of biochar, I don't have time to explain exactly what that means, but it involves the application of charcoal back into the soil to enhance its fertility and increase its carbon uptake. I'll close with this slide. In my own country of Australia, we have embraced this issue of soil carbon to some extent, and I just draw to your attention a piece of legislation passed over 12 months ago now, which allows a voluntary scheme for farmers and land managers to earn carbon credits within Australia in the context now of a system where we have a carbon tax for storing carbon or reducing carbon emissions from the land, and it links into that national scheme. The opposition in our country actually think that soil carbon could be one of the most significant planks in their climate mitigation strategy, but that's because they don't want to put so much effort into reducing reliance on coal as an energy source, so there's a certain amount of dispute about that. So in this context, it is interesting to note that Australia has just announced in the last 10 days that in 2015, when it moves to a full emissions trading system, that will be linked to the European Union ETS, fully linked to it. And it may be that Australian farmers can then be selling the credits from their carbon, if they're recognised by the European Union, to European polluters. So there is certainly movement happening in this area, but a great deal more to be done, I think, within the climate change context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And it's true that the groundwater is also contaminated, and liability issues are very difficult to face. For example, you know that the UN the Framework Convention on Non-Navigational Uses for Fresh Water still not in vigor because of the liabilities, especially regarding the contamination that comes from what is the name in Spanish? We call them
non-source.
Non-source, yes. So it's really a very difficult thing nowadays. Thank you, Rob. And now we have Professor Bernard van Heusden He's a member of CEL Specialist Group on Sustainable Use of Soil Certification of Hasselt University Law School in Belgium. He will speak about the role and benefits of an international instrument for the security and protection of soil in Europe.
Thank you. So finally, in this final presentation, we'll have a look at the European situation. Let me first give you a brief introduction in the history. It's a brief history. I only go back 6 years. But exactly 6 years ago, in September 2006, the European Commission adopted a soil thematic strategy. Yeah. And this strategy contained actually 4 pillars, or focused on 4 pillars, which you can see: the awareness raising, so all kinds of conferences and reports, etc., on raising the awareness of protection of the need of protection of soil, improving research or promoting research on soil, integrating soil protection more in other policies, and then finally, that's the one I first want to look at, legislation. And directly linked to the thematic strategy, the Commission adopted a proposal for a soil framework directive. So this was the first time actually that an institution tried for, in this case, at that time 25 member states, currently we have 27 member states at the European Union, to have a supranational instrument for soil protection. For those who are not from the European Union, just for your information, it's up to the European Commission always to take an initiative for new legislation. So only they have the exclusive right to initiate a new legislation. On the other hand, they cannot adopt it finally. They can propose something, but they cannot agree on it and have it as a real directive. I'll come to that later on. So the proposal